The sound of rain against the window had become Emily Carter's closest companion. It came and went like the season, soft, predictable, and always there when the silence grew too heavy. She sat at her small wooden desk by the window of her apartment, a cup of tea cooling beside her, watching the streetlights shimmer through the mist. Somewhere far below, a child laughed, a car door slammed, and the city carried on as if it didn't notice her stillness. Emily had never been one for grand adventures or loud crowds. She loved small things, quiet mornings, handwritten notes, and the smell of books that had lived 100 lives before hers. She worked as a graphic designer for a local magazine, mostly from home, where her days blended into each other in a slow rhythm of colors, deadlines, and half-finished thoughts. Lately, though, her world had begun to feel smaller. Not empty, just quieter than she ever expected her 30s to be. Friends she once laughed with were scattered across cities and time zones, and phone calls turned into short messages, followed by weeks of silence. Even her mother, who used to call every Sunday evening, had begun forgetting the time difference, her voice drifting away in the noise of her own busy life. Emily told herself she was fine. She had work, she had music, she had the city. But sometimes, when the rain slowed to a whisper and the lights of the next building blinked out one by one, she caught herself whispering his name, Daniel. She hadn't seen him in nearly 7 years. They had met in college, the way most stories begin, by chance. He was majoring in literature. She was studying art. Their paths crossed one late afternoon in the university library when she dropped a stack of sketchbooks and he bent down to help her pick them up. It was one of those moments she never thought about until years later, when she realized how deeply it had shaped her. Daniel was thoughtful, curious, and had that quiet humor that didn't ask for attention but somehow always made her smile. They had shared countless hours between shelves, exchanging books, stories, and dreams that felt too big for the small town they lived in. But after graduation, life had different plans. His father passed away and he moved away to help his family. She stayed behind, telling herself it was temporary, that one day they'd meet again when life settled down. It never did now. 7 years later, Emily sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by sketches and he-read novels, trying to convince herself that missing him was just a habit like checking her phone or watching the rain. But the truth was simpler and harder. She missed the feeling of being seen. That morning, the rain stopped early, leaving a soft chill in the air. Emily put on her coat and decided to walk to the library. It was her favorite place in the city, not because of the books, though she loved them dearly, but because it reminded her of who she used to be before life grew quiet. The library smelled the same as always: old paper, polished wood, and faint coffee from the cafe next door. She wandered through the aisles, tracing her fingers along the spines like she was greeting old friends. Still hiding in the fiction section, said a voice nearby, light and teasing. Emily turned, startled. But it wasn't him, just a librarian passing by, smiling kindly as she rearranged the books. Emily smiled back, her heart easing just a little. She moved toward the back corner, where sunlight pooled across the floor through the tall windows. There, on the highest shelf, she saw "It the River Between Us." The sight made her chest tighten. It was the same book Daniel had lent her in college. It's the one they had argued over for hours, the story of two people separated by time but bound by memory. She reached up for it, but it was just beyond her fingertips. She rose on tiptoe, stretching, her coat brushing against the shelf. The smell of the pages reached her before her hand did faint, familiar and almost comforting. For a second, she could almost hear Daniel's voice, that gentle laugh when she struggled to reach the top shelf. "Need a hand? Short stack," he used to say, smiling as he reached above her with ease. The memory made her smile now, soft and distant. She finally managed to pull the book free and held it against her chest. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from the effort, but from something older, something like longing. She walked toward the reading table by the window, the one near the old radiator that still hummed softly in the cold. The book lay open in front of her, the words blurring a little as her thoughts drifted back to all the things they'd left unsaid. People always said time healed everything. Maybe they were right. But time also preserved certain memories, wrapping them in silence so they would return only when you least expected them. Like a song you hadn't heard in years suddenly playing on the radio. Outside, the rain began again, tapping gently against the glass. Emily rested her chin on her hand and looked out at the gray sky. She didn't know why she came here today. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was hope. Maybe deep down, she's still waiting for something or someone to remind her that stories don't always end when we think they do. Her phone buzzed softly beside her. It was a message from her boss. Don't forget the article designs by Monday. She smiled faintly and turned it face down. For now. She didn't want to think about work or deadlines or the practical details of her quiet life. She wanted to sit in this moment, little longer the smell of rain, the weight of the old book, the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. It was all she had, but somehow it felt enough as she turned the page. A small piece of folded paper slipped out from between the chapters. She frowned and picked it up, her heartbeat quickening without knowing why. It wasn't part of the library copy at least. It didn't look like it. The handwriting on the paper was neat, curved, and strangely familiar. Emily hesitated for a moment, her breath catching slightly. She unfolded it carefully, the edges yellowed with time, and that's when she saw the name written at the top. Emily stared at the note in her hand, her pulse quickening as she read the familiar handwriting. It was short, just a few lines, but the moment she saw his name, everything inside her seemed to pause. If you ever find this, it means the story isn't over yet. Daniel, her throat tightened. She looked around, half expecting to see him standing somewhere nearby, smiling the way he used to when he wanted her to find something hidden. But there was no one. Only the soft shuffle of pages, the faint hum of lights, and the echo of a memory that suddenly felt alive again. She sank into the nearest chair, the letter trembling slightly in her hand. Her mind drifted backward to a time when everything between them had been new, unspoken, and full of possibility. It was sophomore year when she first met Daniel Walker. He had been sitting under the old oak tree behind the library, reading a book and scribbling notes in the margins. Emily had passed by, balancing her sketchpad and a cup of coffee. When a sudden gust of wind sent her pages scattering across the grass, he looked up, startled, then smiled as he began helping her gather them. "You've got a storm of ideas," he said, holding out a page with a charcoal sketch of a bridge. She laughed. "And no system to keep them in order." That was how it started, small moments that built into something larger. They began meeting at the same spot every week, sometimes talking about books, sometimes about art, and sometimes about nothing at all. Daniel was the kind of person who listened with genuine curiosity. He never interrupted, never rushed. He asked questions that made Emily think about things she'd never put into words before. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the campus buildings, Emily had confessed her fear of failing as an artist. "Everyone else seems to know exactly what they're doing," she said quietly. "I feel like I'm pretending." Daniel had smiled then, not with pity, but understanding. "Everyone's pretending, Emily. The ones who keep going just get better at hiding it." That simple truth had stayed with her. Over the months that followed, they became inseparable. They studied together, shared long walks after classes, and sometimes sat in silence, content with the comfort of each other's company. He used to bring her coffee from the campus cafe every morning, always with a tiny sketch of a book or a star on the cup. "It's my way of saying good luck," he'd say with that boyish grin. And she would tease him for it, pretending not to care, though she saved every cup sleeve in a little box she kept hidden under her bed. But life has a way of interrupting even the gentlest stories. During their final year, Tanya's father fell ill. The news came suddenly, and within weeks he made the decision to move back home to help. Emily remembered the night he told her how his voice trembled as he tried to stay strong. How he looked at her like he was memorizing her face. "I'll be back soon," he said. "I just need to take care of a few things." She had nodded, though her heart was breaking. "Of course. You have to go." They promised to stay in touch, but distance has a way of dulling even the brightest connections. At first, there were long phone calls that stretched into the night. Then came shorter texts, followed by silence that neither of them meant to create. Life, responsibilities, and unspoken fears built walls where warmth used to live. Emily buried herself in work after graduation, telling herself it was better not to wait for something uncertain. Yet every time she saw a book he once loved or heard a song they used to share, she felt a quiet ache beneath her ribs. Sometimes, when she passed by the old oak tree near the library, she could almost see him sitting there again, his hair ruffled by the wind. "Hi, Daniel." The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and freshly baked bread from the bakery across the street. Emily stepped out of her apartment with her journal tucked under her arm, feeling an unusual restlessness in her chest. She had spent the night rereading the pages of the blank journal Daniel had given her, imagining the stories they could fill together. Yet the warmth of possibility was tangled with hesitation. She had seen him twice in the past. Few days, brief moments that felt like both reunion and reminder of all the things left unsaid. And today she had promised herself she would speak something that had been growing quietly for years. Emily arrived at the small bookstore before it opened. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside, the familiar scent of paper and coffee greeting her. Daniel was already there, arranging new arrivals on a shelf near the window. He looked up at her arrival, surprise flickering across his face, quickly replaced by a smile. "Early bird," he said softly. "I needed to see you," she admitted, her voice quieter than she expected. He nodded, sensing the weight in her words. "I'm glad you did." They walked toward the back corner, where a small table waited by the window. The morning light poured in, warm and forgiving. Emily sat down and placed her journal on the table, smoothing the cover with her hands. Daniel followed suit, sitting opposite her. His eyes were steady, waiting, patient. Emily took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about us," she began, "and I realized something I've been avoiding for far too long." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "Tell me," he encouraged. "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "I was afraid that if I said how I felt, it would ruin what we had. That the honesty of it might break the memory into pieces I couldn't put back together." Daniel's expression softened. He reached for her hands but paused, letting her continue. "I loved you," she said, finally speaking the words she had carried silently for years. "I loved you more than I realized at the time. And when you left, I thought I had to push it down, pretend it wasn't there. But it didn't go away." For a moment, Daniel said nothing. The weight of her confession filled the room with a quiet intensity. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw the reflection of her own longing in his eyes. "Emily," he said finally, his voice low, careful, "I never wanted to leave. I thought I was doing the right thing. But every day I spent away, I regretted it. I regretted not telling you how much you meant to me. Every single day." Her chest tightened, but not from sadness. This was the release she had been holding her breath for. "You don't know how many nights I imagined this," she whispered. "Imagined telling you. Imagined hearing you say it back." Daniel's gaze softened further, almost tenderly. "I needed time to understand that the right thing isn't always what seems responsible or practical. Sometimes the right thing is honesty. Sometimes it's taking a risk." Emily's eyes glistened as tears threatened to fall. She hadn't realized how much she had wanted to hear these words until now. "I've spent years thinking the moment had passed. I didn't know if I could feel like this again without being hurt." He reached across the table, lightly taking her hands in his. "And I understand that," he said. "But I'm here now, Emily. And if we take it one step at a time, carefully, honestly, maybe we don't have to lose it again." Her throat felt tight, but she nodded. "I don't want to lose this again either." They sat together in silence for a few minutes, letting the words sink in. It was not a grand gesture or a sudden revelation. It was quiet, deliberate, and real. Two hearts honest and unguarded. Finding their way back to each other, Daniel's expression shifted. a flicker of vulnerability crossing his face. "There's something else I need to say," he admitted. "Back when I left, I promised myself I'd be responsible, that I'd do what was expected. But I also promised myself I'd find a way back to you, if fate allowed it. And seeing you now, I realized that promise was meant for today. That's why I stayed in the city, why I took this job here, why I waited." Emily's breath caught. The honesty in his voice was raw and unfiltered. The kind of truth that can only exist when someone has carried it in their heart for years. "You waited?" she asked softly. "I waited," he confirmed. "For the right time, for the right moment, for you to come back into my life. And here you are." Her heart swelled, filled with a mixture of relief, longing, and newfound hope. "I guess we were both waiting," she said, "even if we didn't know it." Daniel nodded, a small, almost shy smile tugging at his lips. It seems so. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the quiet, intense reunion happening inside the bookstore. Inside, Emily and Daniel sat together, hands still lightly clasped. Hearts finally speaking what had long been silent. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. It wasn't a sudden confession that solved everything. It was real, honest, and heartfelt. And for the first time in years, both of them felt the weight of the unspoken lift replaced by a gentle, persistent hope. Emily looked at him, small smile forming. "Then, maybe we can finally start the story we never finished." Daniel's smile mirrored hers, a mixture of relief and quiet joy. "I'd like that," he said softly. "One chapter at a time." The following weeks passed quietly, like gentle waves brushing against the shore. Emily and Daniel found themselves in a rhythm neither of them had anticipated, yet both had longed for in secret. There were no grand gestures or sudden declarations of eternal promises, just ordinary days, made extraordinary by the presence of the other dot each morning. Emily would walk to the bookstore, journal in hand, the pages slowly filling with sketches, thoughts, and little notes for Daniel. And each day Daniel would greet her with that same quiet smile, as though her arrival had been the missing piece of the puzzle he had carried for years. It wasn't perfect. Some mornings, the awkward weight of the past would return briefly, a hesitation lingering in their smiles. They would pause, glance at one another, and then move forward. Their conversations were honest, sometimes hesitant, but always full of intention. One Saturday, the city held a soft, golden light that spilled through the clouds like a promise. The bookstore had a small gathering for local authors, a simple event that Emily decided to attend with Daniel. It was warm and bustling, yet somehow private, a cocoon in the middle of the busy streets. Emily wandered among the shelves, tracing her fingers along the spines, feeling the texture of paper that held so many lives, so many stories. Daniel followed, carrying 2 cups of tea, and handed one to her. "Here," he said quietly, "for keeping us fueled for all our stories." She smiled, taking the cup. "It feels like we're writing one of our own now." He nodded, eyes soft. "I think we finally understand what that means." And in that moment, there was no need for explanations. The weight of years, the ache of separation, the unspoken longing they had all led them to this quiet understanding later. As the afternoon sun faded, they found themselves sitting on a bench outside the bookstore. The streets were alive with the sounds of people, laughter, and the occasional honk of a distant car. But around them, the world felt calm. Emily held her journal on her lap. "I used to be afraid of what might happen if we tried again," she admitted. "Afraid it would be too late." Daniel took a deep breath, the wind rustling the pages of her journal. "I was too," he said. "But I think sometimes the right time isn't when we want it to be. It's when we're ready to face the truth together." She looked up at him, eyes glistening, and nodded. "Then maybe this is it. Our moment." He reached for her hand, their fingers interlacing naturally, like 2 old melodies finally harmonizing after years apart. The touch was gentle, comforting, and full of meaning. No words were needed. Their hearts spoke louder than any sentence could. Over the next few weeks, Emily and Daniel rebuilt their connection. They explored the city together, sharing favorite cafes, quiet streets, and hidden parks. They laughed at old memories and created new ones, slowly weaving the past and present into a tapestry that felt whole. Emily began filling the journal with sketches, inspired by their time together. And Daniel wrote little notes on the pages, lines of poetry, observations, reflections on life and love. Each page became a shared story, a testament to patience, resilience, and quiet devotion. Sometimes late at night, Emily would glance at her window and see Daniel's light on in the bookstore across the street. The simple knowledge that he was there, immersed in his world, brought her a sense of peace she hadn't known she could feel. And Daniel, in turn, would look out his window, catching sight of Emily walking home beneath the soft glow of streetlights, her journal tucked under her arm, and feel a warmth in his chest that years of distance had never extinguished. One evening, as autumn began to fade into early winter, they found themselves walking through a park lined with trees shedding their golden leaves. The wind was crisp, but not cold. Carrying the faint scent of the earth and the promise of new beginnings, they stopped beneath the largest tree, one they had often passed without a word in earlier years. Now they stood quietly together, the leaves falling softly around them. Emily turned to Daniel. "It's strange," she said, "how something you think is over can find a way back." Daniel smiled, brushing a leaf from her coat. "I think it's because the right things never really leave. They wait, quietly, patiently, until we're ready." She nodded. The next morning, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Emily woke to the soft hum of the city outside her window, the kind of morning where everything felt slightly new but familiar. The memory of the note lingered in her thoughts like a melody she couldn't stop humming. She couldn't explain it. But something about those words, "The story isn't over yet," felt alive. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe just nostalgia. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel like the past was only a memory. It felt closer, almost within reach. She slipped the book into her tote bag before leaving for work, though she had no reason to take it. It simply felt wrong to leave it behind. The library was quiet when she returned that afternoon, but something inside her told her she'd be back again soon, even if she didn't yet know why. The day passed in a blur of designs, meetings and polite conversations that never touched anything real. Emily smiled where she had too, contributed her ideas, and hid the fact that her mind was elsewhere. When evening came, she walked home through the same streets she always did, her pace slower than usual. Halfway down Maple Street, she noticed a small new bookstore tucked between two cafes, the kind with handwritten signs and a bell above the door. She didn't remember seeing it before. Something about the warm light inside drew her closer. The bell chimed softly as she entered. The scent of paper and coffee filled the air, comforting and familiar. Rows of wooden shelves stretched out like an invitation. Behind the counter, a man was sorting through a stack of novels, his head bent slightly as he adjusted the display. Emily wandered slowly through the aisles, her eyes tracing the titles. For a moment, she forgot everything, the long years of silence, the unanswered questions, until she reached the back shelf. Her hand brushed against a copy of The River Between Us. Her breath caught. The same book. The same story. The same thread that had led her here. She turned the book over in her hands, feeling its familiar weight, when she heard a voice behind her, low, calm, unmistakably familiar. Still reaching for that one. Her heart stopped. It couldn't be. She turned around slowly, the book still clutched in her hands. Daniel was standing there, looking almost exactly as she remembered. A little older, perhaps, but with that same quiet presence, that same steady warmth in his eyes. He looked surprised, though not completely, as if some part of him had known this moment would come. "Daniel." Her voice was barely above a whisper. He smiled softly. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten how to find me." The words hung between them, fragile and uncertain. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world around them, the shelves, the faint sound of pages turning somewhere in the shop seemed to fade away. Finally, Emily found her voice. "How are you here? I thought you left the city years ago." "I did," he said, nodding. But after my mother passed, I needed a change. I started managing this place for a friend. It was supposed to be temporary. His eyes softened. Then again, most things in my life seem to turn out differently than planned. Emily's chest tightened. She didn't know what to say. The emotions she'd buried for years rose quietly to the surface, not in chaos, but like an old song returning after silence. She laughed lightly, though it trembled. You always did have a thing for old bookstores. And you always managed to find the ones no one else noticed, he replied. Some things don't change. They ended up sitting at a small table near the window, cups of tea between them. The conversation started cautiously about work, the city, the years in between. But as the minutes passed, the distance between them seemed to fade. I found your note, Emily said finally. In the river between us? Daniel's expression softened. I wondered if it would ever find its way to you. You left it there? He nodded slowly. I used to visit the library when I came back to town. I saw the book on the shelf one day, and I don't know. I thought if you ever found it again, maybe it would mean something. Emily looked down at her hands, and it did. Silence settled between them, not awkward, but heavy with meaning. Outside, the sky had begun to turn orange and soft gray, and the reflection of the setting sun touched the glass beside them. I used to think about calling you, Daniel said quietly. 1,000 times, actually. But every time I picked up the phone, I told myself it was too late, that you'd moved on. I told myself the same thing, she admitted, that maybe I imagined it, what we had. He smiled faintly. You didn't. The simplicity of those two words seemed to unlock something in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt seen again, like time hadn't erased what they once shared, just folded it carefully away, till they were ready to find it again. The lights in the shop flickered softly as the evening deepened. Daniel stood and walked to the counter, returning with a small wrapped parcel. He placed it in front of her. What's this? She asked. A book, he said. But not that book. This one's yours. She unwrapped it carefully to find a blank journal, the cover smooth and new. Inside, on the first page, he had written, for the stories we didn't finish, and the ones we still can. Her eyes glistened. You think it's not too late? He smiled. It's only too late if we stop turning pages. Outside, the rain began again, soft and steady against the window. The same rhythm as before, years ago. Emily looked up at him, a quiet smile spreading across her face. Maybe this time, she said, we'll let the story finish itself. Maybe this time, he replied. We'll write it together. As she stepped back out into the rain, the journal pressed close to her heart. Emily realized that sometimes fate doesn't shout. It whispers. It nudges. It leaves a note in an old book and waits patiently for you to find it. And when you finally do, the world feels new again. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The rhythm of the rain outside her window carried her thoughts back to the small bookstore and to Daniel's quiet smile as he handed her the journal. She had read his note inside 12 times, tracing each word like a fragile memory come alive again. For the stories we didn't finish and the ones we still can. It sounded simple, but it wasn't. Every word felt heavy with everything they had once left unsaid. Emily sat up, wrapped in her blanket, staring at the city lights blinking beyond the glass. The ache in her chest wasn't painful exactly. It was the weight of years of moments never spoken, of goodbyes that hadn't really been goodbyes. She wondered if Daniel felt the same, if he was sitting somewhere at that very moment, replaying the day the way she was. Maybe he was. Maybe he wasn't. Either way, the silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like possibility. Across town, Daniel sat at his desk with a cup of tea gone cold beside him. He had the same journal in front of him, its twin. He had bought 2 that morning, intending one as a gift and one for himself. His was still blank. He had told himself for years that what he and Emily shared had been a chapter, a beautiful one. Yes, but a closed one. Yet seeing her again had stirred something quiet but persistent inside him. It wasn't about what had been lost. It was about what might still exist if either of them had the courage to name it. He flipped open the first page and wrote a single sentence. I never forgot you. I just learned how to live with the remembering. Then he closed the journal, unable to continue. The next afternoon, Emily found herself back at the bookstore. She told herself it was just to return the river between us, but deep down, she knew better. The bell above the door chimed softly, and the familiar scent of coffee and paper greeted her. Daniel was behind the counter, sorting through a pile of books. When he looked up, his eyes lit up with quiet surprise that quickly softened into warmth. You came back, he said, smiling. I still had your book, she replied, and I thought you might want it back. He shook his head gently. Keep it. I think it found the right person. They both smiled, small, tentative smiles that carried more meaning than words ever could. For a moment, they just stood there, surrounded by the low hum of the shop and the soft ticking of the wall clock. Do you have time for tea? He asked. Emily nodded. I was hoping you'd say that. They sat at the same table near the window. Outside, the street was alive with quiet movement, people hurrying home. Umbrellas glistening under the fading light. Daniel stirred his tea absent-mindedly. Do you ever think about how easily people drift apart? Emily glanced up. All the time. It's strange, he continued softly. You spend years believing someone is part of your story, and then one day they're just gone. And you tell yourself it's life, that it's normal. But it never feels normal, does it? She shook her head slowly. No, it doesn't. He met her gaze then, steady, searching, vulnerable. I should have called you Emily. I thought leaving was the right thing at the time. But I should have said more before I did. Her throat tightened. And I should have stopped you, or at least told you what I felt. But I didn't know how. The words hung in the air like fragile glass, clear, delicate, and long overdue. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. What did you feel? Emily hesitated. Her heart raced, but her voice was calm when she finally spoke. That you were the one person who understood me without needing me to explain anything. That every time you looked at me, I felt like the noise in the world quieted down. And when you left, it got loud again, louder than I expected. Daniel took a slow breath. I felt that too. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the years between them ceased.